Welcome to Season 1, Episode 7 of the Nitty Gritty of Modern Caregiving. I'm Tracy Neal. This week, as we celebrate our growing caregiving community with our first 1,000 downloads across 20 different countries, we offer a warm welcome to our newest listeners in Australia, New Zealand, India, and Uzbekistan. We are happy to have you. Now, in the interest of time, we're going to forego our usual self-care moment and jump right into today's special guest. It's believed that up to 48% of couples divorce or separate after a disability like a sudden spinal cord injury, but not all of them. Michelle Ruetschle is the exception. She is a spiritual director and author who wrote a powerful book about her unforgettable journey caring for her husband Steve after a horrible accident. Here she is. Michelle, thank you so much for joining us today. I have to tell you, your story is so inspirational. It's such a love story. It just warms your heart. And I can't wait for you to take us through that whole journey that has changed your life so profoundly. But I have to say to our listeners that with this episode in particular, if you get the opportunity to not only listen to it as an audio podcast, but also go to our YouTube channel and watch it, that video that you share and the photographs, they're so moving and really tell a large chunk of this story. So if you have the opportunity, I highly encourage you to go and also watch it. Now, that said, Michelle, you call yourself a global nomad, and it fits. You were born in Indonesia. You lived in many countries as a child, in part because your father worked for the Ford Foundation and the UN. Can you take us back to your childhood and share a little bit about it?
Yeah, I was so fortunate to have a father who also was a global nomad. And because of his work with refugees, we lived all over the world. I lived in 4 countries by the time I was 10. My mother is a Dutch national, so she still lives in Holland. And so I've also grown up with a foot in 2 different cultures and 2 different languages. And I also was exposed to the realities of how most of the world lives, and I understood the privilege of the American lifestyle, which I consider a great gift.
It gives you perspective, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm. It does. It does. And I found that so valuable that I did the same thing to my own children and raised them overseas. Yeah.
You studied political science, Mandarin, and law. At what point did you meet the love of your life, Steve?
Oh, yeah. I was studying for the bar exam, actually. Terrible time to fall in love in some ways. But I met him through a mutual friend, and we fell hard and fast, got married very quickly, and sort of plunged into life together. He was willing to consider living abroad, too, which was really important for me. And yeah, we got hit with lightning bolts.
For many, many years to come in different ways, and we're going to talk about that. So you lived in the Philippines for a while. Tell me about what he does and what drew you to the Philippines. You had one of your sons there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, we moved there. I had said to him as we were talking about getting married that if he was willing to consider living abroad, I would marry him. But if not, I might not. So he was looking around for what to do. He had been a musician. He had been a therapist, actually, and an artist. And now he was training to be a pastor. So once he was ordained as a pastor, we found a position in the Philippines, something we never could have imagined. And we moved there and fell in love with the people. I thought we would be there for a few years. We were there for 12 years. So
Wow.
a long, long time. Yeah.
A very long time, with no idea that your life was about to change in such a profound and dramatic way. You were on leave in the United States in North Carolina in the mountains. Your husband, Steve, rode motorcycles and something happened.
Yeah. We actually will never know exactly what happened because he doesn't remember. And he was on the Blue Ridge Parkway, which is a very twisty road. And so no one saw what happened. However, his brother was riding behind him and came around the corner and found Steve lying in a ditch, not moving, crying out for help, and crying out actually in prayer too to God, and in clear distress. And so that was the beginning of something we never could have imagined. Yeah.
He was airlifted to the hospital.
Yeah, it was a slow dawning for me. I got a phone call. Steve was in an accident, and I thought, oh, shoot, he broke his leg or an arm, and, but he'll be okay. It was a 7-hour drive from where I was, actually, because I wasn't with them. And I drove with one of Steve's brothers to the hospital. And as we drove, the phone calls were coming in. It was actually the surgeon. They performed immediate surgery on him. And so the surgeon was the one who said it was a spinal cord injury, C6, C7, and he likely will never walk again. It was shocking to me. I had not even considered that possibility until that moment. Yeah.
C6 and C7, that's pretty high up, right below the neck, above the shoulder blades. And so everything below at that point, he had no feeling.
If you've heard the term paraplegia, that's usually from the waist down paralysis. Steve was what was called a quadriplegic, so shoulders down. Some people have it even worse, but he had the tiniest bit of movement. His hands became kind of claws, and he could sort of do this tiny bit of movement, and that was actually very, very helpful. In the world of quadriplegia, any kind of movement you try to use to survive and have some level of independence. So,
speaking of survival, how did you guys survive that moment? Those photographs, wow.
Yeah, he was intubated and couldn't breathe on his own. I could speak to him. He was in and out of clarity at that time, and it was touch and go for a while. He had a second surgery. He got pneumonia. In ICU, you never know what's going to happen. And so for a while, we weren't sure whether he would live or die, honestly. And his life hung in the balance. He was fighting for his life, for sure.
I know you're a prayerful woman.
Yeah, I prayed, actually. I found myself praying, Lord, do you want me to pray for his healing, or do you want me to let him go? I didn't know how to pray in that moment. And I literally was asking God, how do I pray? How do I even pray in this moment? Again, having known and lived in a world where loss happens and tragedy happens, knowing that as a pastor's wife, as the daughter of, someone who worked with refugees, I didn't know.
Wow. How did you explain it to your boys? Were they there with you?
No, we kept them out of it. They were really young. They were 8, 7, and 2. And so they stayed with their grandparents. And my guess, I wasn't there at that point to explain anything, but I think the family just kept it very childlike. Eventually, they did come and visit us at the hospital, and I was wholly given over to Steve's survival at that point. My priorities felt very clear. I'm so grateful to his family for watching over them. Yeah.
I love the drawings that they made for their father, for you, to kind of show that they were sort of aware, but in a sweet, pure, childlike way, that daddy's been hurt and will need some time to heal.
Yeah. Yeah. Kids are so resilient, and they take their cues from the parents. Yeah, they had a surprising hope. The first time they saw their dad in a wheelchair, they just climbed on with him. Steve is very, very funny, and he's very positive, and he just brought that to them. I don't think we were hiding that it was difficult, but we had a strange kind of peace in the midst of it all in some ways, and I think they took their cues from us. The wheelchair became a place of play for them in many ways, and They
Maybe
were,
that's a
yeah,
blessing, right?
yeah, yeah, it was.
Yeah.
We had to, embrace our life with them and carry on for them. And that was a blessing. Yeah.
What happened to your whole life though? Because you had a whole life overseas. Does it just shut down? Do you sell everything? What do you do?
For so long, we just didn't know what would happen. And so we lived in this great uncertainty. So we had our church in the Philippines just pack everything and put it in the church basement. We weren't sure for a while whether we would return or not. It was unlikely that we would return, but what would we do? I mean, we lost everything. We lost the job. We didn't know whether Steve would ever be able to work again. We sold our one house because it wasn't wheelchair accessible. The kids, school, what were we going to do? Yeah, we lost everything. Every marker of our life, every certainty was gone in a flash. Yeah.
That is rock bottom.
It's rock bottom. Yeah.
But you were facing up though, because even in his struggle, I could see a certain determination. I went through a situation where I had to learn how to walk and talk and see and everything again after a surprise illness. And so I know how hard those first steps are. Like I stood up and there was a OT person on either side. And I'm like, I can take a step. I couldn't see them, but I knew they were there, fell flat on my face. But there was something about him while he was going through all of the hard work that it takes to be able to stand up again on your feet and take one step. He had sort of a pleasant, a hopeful air about him. It was quite remarkable.
Yeah. People were so complimentary to me about my caregiving, and I always said he made it easy because he had just an incredible positivity, still does. And we'll get to this, but he lives with a lot of struggles still in his body. And the period between taking that first step and the initial accident was, I want to say, 6 months at least until a tiny step, but no real independence or movement for a good 9 months. So this was a long, long, long journey. And he was so persistent. I cannot speak enough, though, to the benefit of having community around you. We had so much support, so many prayers, but also real support. People helping, friends who were PTs even coming and helping with him for free, and people, giving us money to have a house cleaner. I mean, I had 3 kids. It took 2 hours to get Steve ready every morning. I was up multiple times in the night with him, shifting him so that he wouldn't get bed sores. And because with complete paralysis, that is one of the most dangerous things. Many people die from that. Famous people who have become quadriplegics, they die from bed sores. And so the caregiving was endless, but we had so much support. I can't tell you. I think that was the silver lining. I mean, the love that came toward us was stunning, really stunning.
You're very fortunate. So at some point he began to get some feeling back. You said he had a little bit, he had like sort of claws with his hands, but he began to be able to move a little bit more. I remember a video. He was stretched out on his back in a wheelchair, and I think it was his first outing to the zoo. Do you remember that day?
I remember that day. He was still fully quadriplegic that day. So Steve was in ICU for about 3 weeks. And then he was in a hospital setting for full time for another 2 months.
How does it feel, your first field trip?
Awesome.
Would you care to elaborate?
It feels glorious, freedom, human, expanded and wonder.
And so this was a long time. And they're training you on how to live as a quadriplegic, aside from also recovering from its surgeries. Anyway, the occupational therapists are doing all kinds of life skills with you, teaching you how to brush your teeth with special contraptions because he couldn't hold a toothbrush, or, how to navigate a wheelchair. And this was the first outing where he went in a wheelchair van, and came to the zoo. And we attached a cart to the back and we put the kids in it. And this was really a big moment for the kids. This was the first time they had fun with their dad again. We thought the zoo would be a good place to be for them. So there was a lot of joy in that moment, and a reality too of what our life might be like.
I love the moment at the end where he sort of closes his eyes and puts his head on your shoulder, maybe from exhaustion, but also from pure love. It's just the relationship between the two of you. I imagine having gone through all of this and still going through it, it makes you even stronger.
It does. The statistics for couples who go through things like this are not good. It's funny, I wrote a book about the experience, and people commented that it felt like a love story, which I think you mentioned too, which wasn't what my intention when I wrote it. But it's true that we became closer as a result. I credit our shared faith with that too, a faith that really emphasizes serving one another and humility. I credit his optimism and his capacity to hope with that. I was constantly looking for signs of depression. And while we danced around that a little bit, he really never did sink into that. I mean, I can also say, by the grace of God, because I don't think that's a sign of weakness. I think that would be a very natural physical response, even to everything that he endured. So we were also very fortunate. Our community, being surrounded, was so helpful too. So we had a lot of supports that helped that. And we were also just very good friends as well as lovers, in our marriage. And so we could lean into that.
Did you face a depression yourself? Because a lot of caregivers do.
Yeah, I did not. I cannot tell you why I did not, because you're right. It'd be a legitimate response. I did, though, just kill my adrenals. I actually slept in the hospital with Steve every night and would go home to be with the kids during the day and just burn the candle at both ends. And then when he came home from the hospital, I was up in the night. And spoiler alert, when we got back to the Philippines, which we did in the end manage to do, I found I couldn't stay awake to save my life. I mean, I had no adrenaline left. In fact, Steve was hospitalized at one point, even then, a year and a half after the accident, in the ICU with a life-threatening issue related to his injury and the medicines he was taking. And I could not stay awake. I curled up on the tile floor in the ICU. He was terrified. In a normal circumstance, I would have been able to stay up with him. I couldn't do it. So it took probably another year and a half to feel like I could rely on adrenaline again to get through things. Yeah.
We have a mutual friend. Her name is Christine. She was featured in our first episode of The Nitty Gritty of Modern Caregiving. She's caring for her beautiful son, Tully, and he has special needs. And one of the things that Christine said was that she went to a women's conference and she learned there that you have to figure out what restores you. And it might not be sleep. It might be something else. For her, it ended up being long walks. For me, I'm caring for my mother. She has dementia. It's water. I run in the water, swim in the water, and I feel restored. What is it for you, or what has it been through this journey that restores you?
I have to say prayer is one thing. Prayer. And when I say prayer, I don't mean just the kinds of prayers we legitimately pray, help, that kind of thing, but contemplative prayer, meditative prayer. So slowing down, breathing deep, trusting God, right? Wrestling with God, asking the hard questions of God, lamenting with God, grieving with God. I mean, for me, not everyone has that faith dimension. But for me, that was very important. And it carried me. Even for Steve, while he was in the hospital, we had a friend who was Orthodox, a Christian Orthodox, and he brought an image of Jesus, an icon, and we put it above Steve's bed. He was still in a lot of pain. He couldn't move. So the only way to see the icon was above him as he's lying on his back. And he would say that what got him through was the suffering of Jesus, like knowing that Jesus also suffered was really important for him in his own suffering. And that was important for me too. I think I began to think of the suffering God became a very important element for me of feeling companioned by God on the journey. Yeah.
Did you ever get mad at God or say, why us? Why him?
Yeah. Again, something that is so legitimate, and I often invite others to do that. I didn't have that. I had grief. I think because I grew up internationally, because even living in the Philippines, we saw people whose lives were unfairly devastated again and again and again. I never had an expectation that my life would be, easy is not the right word, but I didn't expect my life to flow. Certainly not as a believer, but just in general. I knew that life is unfair, and I never attributed it to God. I felt God's grief over the accident almost immediately. I always say to people, though, I want to be clear. 2 years later, our middle son got diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. And I did get angry with God then. I did feel God's absence then. And so, it was a grace over that time, but it wasn't my sort of great spiritual, maturity or whatever that made that happen. And so, but it was a gift, and I did not take it for granted.
How did you get through that?
I got angry with God. I mean, I wrestled with God for a long time, and I volunteered less for a while. I did less at our church for a while. But I attended. I kept sort of my rhythms. I didn't lose my faith in God. I just didn't feel God. And that's sometimes called the dark night of the soul. And I would imagine many caregivers would experience something like that. You just walk through it step by step. You don't know how long it'll last. And in the book, I likened that even Steve's season to the desert. Sometimes you think nothing is happening in the desert, but the desert is full of tiny little blooms and little bits of life, and very resilient life in the desert. You learn a different way of living. You learn how to appreciate different things, really little things. You have to be more attentive for life in the desert. And so, yeah, I guess I learned resilience. Faith is, in things we don't see. And so you only develop that muscle, unfortunately, when things don't go our way, right? And but it wasn't fun.
I imagine.
End it.
I'm sure it wasn't. What made you decide to write the book, 40, the year my husband became a quadriplegic?
Yeah. I really felt God inviting me to share it. One thing that happened when Steve had his accident is I started writing a blog. Part of that was literally, I was so pressed for time, and so many people wanted to know how things were going. People wanted to pray. I wanted people to pray. So writing a blog was a way to say it once, and anybody who wanted to know could come there. And what I noticed was it hit on other people's stories, other people's suffering. Everybody has a story. You know it well. It sounds like you have a number of stories. And so I noticed that unwrapping my story invited other people to enter that space with their own. And so I just felt like God was inviting me to do that more concretely in a book form. But it became a blessing for me because it was a space for me to process what happened. And, the accident happened when my husband was 40. And I discovered that 40 is kind of a symbolic number in the Christian scriptures, and it symbolizes testing. It symbolizes suffering. And so I wrote the book in 40 chapters. I told the story in 40 reflections. And it was also an opportunity for me to explore, how do you have faith when there is suffering? And that was always a question for me, and continues to be. It's not one that has an easy answer, but I think the more stories we gather up that are honest and true about that, the more we learn and understand. So we need those stories.
You said something in your book about learning to live richly within
Mhm.
suffering. I thought that
Mhm.
was really something to stop and think about. How do we live richly within suffering? Because we're not going to escape suffering.
A lot of people invited me to provide an answer and a how-to on this kind of thing, and there just isn't one. And it looks different for each of us. But again, using that desert analogy, we can learn to live in those spaces. My husband would be a better person to talk about that than me, even, because he lives with constant pain and limitations. And I would say that we have a lot of joy too. And so it's possible to find joy. I think gratitude is a huge piece of that. You become more grateful for the little things. Every time I take a walk, I'm so grateful, because for him, he can't, he can't walk without severe pain. Never thought about being grateful about that before. So I think I've become a more grateful person in many ways. Yeah.
Let's talk about how he's doing. So long walks, very
Yeah.
difficult if they happen at all. Still some bladder, bowel, all sorts of issues that we're just talking to caregivers, so we talk about these things pretty openly, but a lot of issues that you still have to deal with, right?
Yeah. And I think something that's unique to our situation now. So Steve is able to walk, but short distances and with a lot of pain, and a lot of weight. If you think about muscles that aren't firing with the nerves properly, it's like lifting, 100 pounds to take a step. He has very little sensation from the shoulders down, so that affects his bowel and bladder as well. He doesn't heal easily. He doesn't regulate his temperature well. And then he has nerve pain constantly. And so it's very humbling and very difficult. But if you don't know that, he looks pretty well. And so when he was in a wheelchair, there were a lot of accommodations that were made for him. But now, it's kind of an invisible disability, and that can be a hard one to navigate. You have to advocate for yourself. You have to remind people. You have to constantly work within the limits of energy and pain. He's constantly thinking about how much he can do, where he can sit, where the nearest bathroom is. He's dehydrating himself often in order to get through a day or a series of meetings. And then, there are a lot of humbling experiences, accidents and things. And it's hard. Yeah. And he pastors a large church. It's a very visible role. And it takes his whole self to do that, just to do that. Yeah. So we do a lot of dividing and conquering in order to manage our lives. Yeah.
So your relationship, your intimacy changes if he
Mm-hmm.
still has issues from the shoulders down. That's
Yeah.
another thing that a lot of caregivers have to deal with in different ways. Dementia, the number of things that can change that. How are you keeping your relationship strong when that part goes away?
Yeah. Great question. Honestly, Steve would say that that's the biggest loss. And he's not alone in that in the quadriplegia community. They would say, I'd rather have that than be able to walk, for their relationships, their loved ones. It's a huge loss. Um, actually, right in the beginning, I had this sense to give him freedom around that. So I was like, honey, we're going to just put that aside for a year. And honestly, that stretched to 2 years. I just said, let's not even go there because there was so much grief for both of us in learning to re-engage in that. And we were learning how to just live. We were re-entering having a job and having kids with all the limitations that he had. And there was so much to grieve because he was an artist, a musician. He was very athletic. There were so many areas to grieve. And I think that intimacy was one of the most tender ones. And so we dealt with a lot of the other ones first, wisely, I think. But then we had to tiptoe back in and, we found our way. But it's still a tender place of loss. Honestly, I don't think you ever fully, it can never be the same.
Right.
But we embrace what is, and there's a lot of love there to carry us through. Yeah.
That's beautiful.
Yeah. I'm grateful you brought it up, Tracy, because it's an area that people don't get to talk about very much. I think it's a huge issue for a lot of people who have been through traumatic loss, paralysis or other brain injuries, other things that can happen to couples. And we don't talk about it. We don't talk about it. And so again, there's both gratitude for what you do have, what you have regained, some form of movement, not total paralysis. And yet there's so much loss. It can never look the same. Yeah. I tell people Steve has the body of an 85-year-old man. I feel like that can help, understand some of his capacity. But he has the soul of a young person. Yeah. So it's complicated.
It is complicated. Now, would that be one of the subjects that you talk about with people who reach out to you? Because I know not only are you an author now, but you offer services. It's very similar to spiritual counseling, but it's not exactly that. So can you explain that?
Yeah, I am a spiritual director. I've been doing that for about 5 years now. And spiritual direction, it's like companioning someone spiritually. It began in the early church, really in the monastic communities. People would come and talk to the monks and the nuns on a regular basis about their spiritual lives. So it's not so much problem solving as a kind of sacred listening for the movements of God in a person's life, a spiritual friendship of sorts. It's not an emergency situation the way you might with a counselor. It's more of an ongoing discipline of taking time to assess your life spiritually, to talk with someone who's kind of looking for those movements in your life, to get in touch with your soul and what's happening at a soul level. So I love it. I love it. They're deep and meaningful conversations. Yeah.
That's really fascinating.
Yeah. And I do think that it can be a resource for someone who's in caregiving over a long period of time. There are a lot of Christian spiritual directors. There are also more spiritual directors in a more inclusive way to other faiths and a more generally spiritual way. And so there are spiritual directors of all kinds out there for people who want to engage with the spiritual path within the hardship of caregiving. Yeah.
That's really good. I mean, we hear about support groups, a lot of other resources out there, but this is a very specific one. Well, as we begin to wrap up here, anything else that you want to share with our viewers or our listeners just about getting through the caregiving journey? For all of us, it's not short. It's a marathon and it's not easy. And we're here to create community and try to support each other.
Yeah, well, you said it. I was going to say community. I think having that support around us, I had to find my own spaces, my own people apart from him as well. And having patience with yourself, grace with yourself in the process. You're not going to do it perfectly. I'm so grateful for your podcast, Tracy, because as you know, the caregivers get lost. There's a tendency to think that, and I struggle with this too, to think that my problems are less significant, so I shouldn't complain, right? But we need care too. We need to sustain. We need sustainable rhythms. I mean, this is something we look at in spiritual direction too. Like, how do you create spiritual rhythms that are nourishing for your life? Silence and solitude, nature, exercise, sleep. These are all things that help sustain us. Prayer. We need to find our own rhythms somehow. And they might be very small because caregiving can take up our whole lives. Look for those places and spaces and people who offer support. Yeah. I respect caregivers so much.
Are you optimistic about the future?
Yeah. I mean, honestly, health wise, body wise, Steve's aging process will not be easy, but we love each other well. We have built a friendship in the midst of hardship, and I think we're going to make it just fine. Yeah.
I think you are too. Michelle, thank you so much. We really appreciate you sharing your stories and your story as a couple and how you've leaned on each other to get through it, because that's what we need to know, that it's okay to lean on each other to get through our difficult times too.
Yeah. Thank you. What a pleasure to be with you.
Okay. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with spiritual director and author Michelle Ruetschle. What a remarkable woman. If you'd like to reach out to her, we'll include her contact information in the show notes. That does it for this episode. Only one episode left in season 1. Remember to eat right, exercise, and seek joyful moments. Caregiving family, you are not alone. Be sure to watch and subscribe on YouTube at Nitty Gritty Modern Caregiving. That's Nitty Gritty Modern Caregiving. Take care, everyone.